The Eternal Conclave station had been floating in the dark between three star systems for over 9,000 years. It was older than most civilizations currently sitting on its council floor. Its walls had absorbed the voices of species that no longer existed. Its corridors had seen wars start and end with a handshake. It had watched empires rise, stumble, and quietly disappear. And in all that time, nothing had truly surprised it. At least, that was how Archon Velsarath liked to describe the station, as if the place itself shared his patience and his calm. He was the oldest sitting member of the Galactic Council, a reptilian being from the Sarath homeworld, with dark golden scales and eyes that never seemed to fully close. He had held his seat for over 300 years. In that time, he had approved the entry of 11 new species into the Council. All 11 had been, in his private estimation, relatively unremarkable. In it, they had come in, learned the rules, sat down, and behaved themselves. He expected the 48th admission to be no different. The species in question was called humanity. They came from a single planet in an unremarkable solar system at the edge of one of the galaxy's quieter spiral arms. They had only achieved faster-than-light travel 40 years ago. They had only made confirmed contact with alien life 32 years ago. By galactic standards, they were infants. Loud, curious, fast-moving infants who had barely stopped fighting each other long enough to look up at the stars. Velsarath had reviewed the basic contact report. Nothing in it alarmed him. Short-lived species, biological reproduction, emotional decision-making, high aggression index, but nothing outside the range of what the Council had seen before. The committee had debated their entry for 2 years, which felt generous. He had voted in favor, but mostly because denying them would have required more paperwork than approving them. The standard civilizational readiness assessment had been assigned to the academic chamber as a formality. Every new species went through it. The results were filed, archived, and mostly never read again. It was the galactic equivalent of ticking a box. Scholar Cass Nemera had been given the human assessment almost by accident. She was young by Kelvery standards, barely past her 3rd decade, eyes with pale gray skin and large dark eyes built for reading in low light. Her species were natural archivists. They loved data the way other species love food or sunlight. She had spent the last 4 years in the academic chamber, cataloging the cultural histories of species already in the Council, cross-referencing trade agreements with agricultural development cycles. It was quiet work. She preferred quiet work. And her supervisor had handed her the human assignment on a Tuesday morning with very little ceremony. Standard cultural dossier, he had said, already walking away. War history, governance structures, social development, routine assessment. Should take you a few days. Nimara had nodded and opened the data request on her terminal. The archive delivery took 11 hours. She sat watching the progress bar for most of the afternoon, assuming it was a network error. It was not a network error. When the download completed, she opened the index file. It was 4,316 pages long. She stared at it for a moment. Then she scrolled to the top and looked at the first entry in the war history subfile. It was dated approximately 10,000 years before humanity had made contact with any alien species. She scrolled to the bottom of the list. The final entry was from just 8 years ago, a border skirmish between 2 human political groups on a colony world. And there was no gap in the timeline. No long, peaceful stretch. No quiet century where nothing had happened. The entries ran continuously, like a river that never dried up, from the first scratch records of human tribal conflict all the way to the present day. Nimra made herself a cup of tea and started reading. She did not sleep that night. At the same time, on the station's diplomatic wing, Ambassador Ilara Voss was settling into her assigned quarters. The room was functional and clean, designed for a species slightly taller and narrower than she was, so the furniture felt a little wrong. She adjusted the chair at the desk, sat down, and looked out the viewport at the stars. She was 44 years old, dark-haired, with the kind of face that looked calm even when it wasn't. She had spent 12 years as a diplomat before being assigned this post, working in conflict zones and failed negotiations, and rooms where people were barely managing not to kill each other. She was good at staying still in difficult situations. She had been chosen for this assignment largely because of that quality. She had been given a full briefing on the Council before her departure from Earth. She had read about Velserath. She had read about the Council's internal politics, the species most likely to be friendly to humans, the ones most likely to be indifferent, and the handful most likely to be quietly hostile. She was not afraid. She was something more useful than unafraid. She was prepared. On her first morning at the station, she attended the introductory reception for new council staff. The room held roughly 80 beings from a variety of species. Most of them ignored her in the polite way that people ignore things they don't consider important. A few looked at her with open curiosity. One large delegate from the Theron Collective spent several minutes examining her hands. Velserath appeared near the end of the reception, sweeping through the room with the ease of someone who owned it. He paused when he reached Voss. He looked down at her. He was considerably taller, and smiled with his mouth, which on his species was not a warm expression. "Ambassador Voss," he said, "welcome to the conclave. I trust your species found the journey comfortable." "Quite comfortable, thank you, Arshan," she said. "Good." He glanced around the room, as if already losing interest. "The assessment process should not take long. Your species file is being compiled now. I expect it will be a thin document." He paused, and the pause had a kind of weight to it. Young civilizations tend not to have very much history worth examining. Several nearby delegates heard this. One of them made a sound that translated roughly as quiet laughter. Voss smiled back at him. The smile did not reach her eyes, but it was perfectly polite. "Akur, I'm sure the assessment will be thorough," she said. Velserath moved on. The delegate who had laughed moved with him. Voss held her cup of whatever the station called coffee and looked out at the room. She was not embarrassed. She was not angry. She was, if she was honest with herself, familiar with this moment. She had stood in rooms full of people who underestimated her before. She had learned a long time ago that the most effective response was patience. She thought about the data archive, the 11-hour download, the 4,000-page index. She thought about what was in that file. She set her cup down and walked back to her quarters. That evening, she opened her personal log and made a short entry. Day 1 at the conclave. Reception went as expected. Velserath is exactly what the briefings described. He thinks we are unremarkable. He thinks this assessment will be a formality. She paused, looking at the viewport again. Oh, and he hasn't read the file yet. Back in the academic chamber, Namara had been reading for nearly 30 hours with only short breaks. She had stopped twice to eat something and once to stare at the wall for a while before returning to her screen. The data was unlike anything she had processed before. She had worked with war histories from a dozen species. She understood the concept: conflict over resources, territory, biological competition. It was a common feature of pre-spaceflight civilizations. It was expected. It was, in the context of galactic history, normal. This was not normal. It was not the scale, although the scale was staggering. It was not the weapons, although the weapons became progressively more terrifying as the timeline moved forward. It was something underneath all of that, something in the texture of it. Humans didn't just fight. They studied how to fight. They wrote books about it, long, detailed books. And then they argued about those books. And then they wrote more books disagreeing with the first books. And then they tested those theories against each other in actual wars. They developed entire fields of thought dedicated to the strategy and philosophy and ethics of killing people. They created ranks, structures, ceremonies, rituals around warfare. They gave their weapons names. They told stories about their battles for generations afterward. And then, when a war ended, they built monuments to the dead and went home and started preparing for the next one. Nimara sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling. The Kelvari had a saying that roughly translated as, "Some things cannot be understood from the outside, only endured." She was beginning to feel the edges of that idea very clearly. She had a 30-minute slot scheduled in the council's academic chamber for the following week to present her preliminary findings. She had assumed she would fill maybe 20 minutes of it. Now she was thinking about asking for more time, much more time. She opened a request form and typed in a new estimate. 6 hours. She stared at the number. Then she left it there and sent the request. Somewhere deep in the file, she had just reached the 20th century. There were still 8,000 years to go before she reached the present day. She made another cup of tea, adjusted her reading light, and kept going. Outside the station's viewport, the stars were very still. The galaxy turned slowly around its ancient center, indifferent and vast. The station held its breath, the way it always did when something was about to change. And in a small, quiet room in the academic chamber, a young scholar from a species that had never fought a single war in its entire history was reading about a species that had never truly stopped. And somewhere underneath the numbers and the dates and the casualty counts, she was starting to understand something that the rest of the council did not yet know. Humanity was not a young civilization that had yet to grow up. Humanity was something else entirely. She just hadn't found the word for it yet. The academic chamber was a wide circular room with tiered seating that curved inward like the inside of a bowl. It could hold 300 delegates comfortably. On a normal assessment presentation day, it held about 40. Most of them were junior staff, researchers and policy aides who had been assigned to attend because their supervisors hadn't wanted to sit through something dull. Nimara arrived early and set up her display screens with quiet efficiency. She had been awake for most of the past 4 days. She had combed through over 6,000 years of human military history, cross-referenced it against social development records, political structure timelines, and cultural documentation. She had flagged passages, organized data points, and built a presentation structure. She had also, at several points during the process, sat completely still for long stretches of time, staring at nothing in particular. The 40 delegates filed in and found their seats, talking among themselves, reviewing notes on unrelated matters, doing the small distracted things that people do when they expect to be bored for the next half hour. Nimara waited for the room to settle. Then she began. The species designated as humanity, she said, Quash has been engaged in organized armed conflict for a documented period of approximately 10,000 years. She paused to let the translator systems carry the words to every ear in the room. I want to be precise about that number. That is not 10,000 years that includes occasional conflicts. That is 10,000 years of near-continuous, formally organized, strategically planned warfare. There is no meaningful gap in the record. A few heads lifted from their notes. Not all of them, but a few. She moved to her first display. Population figures, casualty estimates, rough timelines, clean data, presented clearly. The numbers were large but not shocking on their own. Other species had experienced high casualty events. The Theron Collective had nearly gone extinct in a biological war 3,000 years ago. Loss of life was not a new topic in this room. Then she moved to the second display. What is unusual, she said, is not the quantity of human conflict. It is the nature of it. She pulled up a section of the file from roughly 5,000 years ago. A war between two large human civilizations on their home continent. Standard resource conflict on the surface. But then she walked the room through what was underneath. The two sides had different beliefs about how the universe had been created. Not different resources, not different territory disputes, different stories about the origin of existence. And those different stories had been reason enough to fight a war that lasted, in various forms, for over a century and killed millions of people. They fought over an idea, Nimara said simply. Not land, not water, not biological survival. An idea, an invisible concept that could not be seen, measured, or physically held. The room was a little quieter now. She moved forward in the timeline. She showed them the first recorded military manuals, documents written by human strategists that broke down warfare into principles, theories, and teachable methods. These documents were studied by human military leaders for thousands of years after they were written. Humans had built entire schools dedicated to studying how to fight better. She showed them the records of what she had come to privately think of as the endurance events. Wars where one side had already lost, by any rational measure, and continued fighting anyway. A small island nation holding out against a continent's military power. A city under siege for nearly 3 years, its population starving, its buildings rubble, still refusing to surrender. A general retreating through frozen wilderness for months, losing most of his force, and returning years later to fight again. There is a pattern in the human record, Nimara said, that I do not have a precise scientific term for. The closest translation in my language would be something like The refusal to accept the conclusion that the evidence suggests. A senior delegate from the Fari species, a tall, pale being named Oren, leaned forward slightly in his seat. He had been paying close attention for the last 20 minutes. Namara moved to a section of the file that she had spent the longest time sitting with in silence. In the early period of their 21st century, she said, humanity developed, for the third time in its history, weapons capable of destroying all life on their planet. Multiple nations held these weapons. The political tension between several of these nations was, by any analysis, extreme. She let the display figures speak for themselves for a moment. They did not use them. The room was quiet. This is the third time this occurred, she continued. The first time, the weapons were dismantled before deployment. The second time, they were developed in secret and never used. The third time, multiple powers held them simultaneously, pointed at each other, for decades. They built treaties. The treaties broke. They built new ones. Generations of humans lived their entire lives knowing that, on any given day, someone might make the decision that ended their world. She paused. And they got up in the morning anyway. Delegate Orun's aide leaned toward him and said something quietly. Orun did not respond. When he was watching Namara very carefully, she continued through the file. She showed the development of military medicine. The humans had created entire fields of science dedicated to keeping wounded soldiers alive so they could return to the fight. She showed the records of what humans called psychological warfare, deliberate efforts to break down the mental state of an enemy without physical contact. She showed them the records of human espionage, a practice so refined and so deeply built into human military culture that every major conflict had entire networks of it operating simultaneously. They were not simply violent, Namara said. They were systematic. They studied violence the way other species study agriculture or astronomy. They passed the knowledge down across generations. They improved it. They competed to improve it faster than the other side was improving it. She had now been speaking for 4 hours. The room that had begun with 40 half-attentive delegates was now full. Word had moved through the station's staff corridors in the way that unusual things sometimes did. More people had come in. Others had stayed when they had meant to leave. The total in the room was now somewhere above 150. Namara barely noticed. She was deep in the file now. She showed them the records from the major wars of humanity's 20th century. The figures were almost too large to feel real. Tens of millions dead in a span of years. Then it happened again, just 20 years later, on a larger scale. She showed them the physical maps, how a significant portion of a major continent had been reduced to rubble in the span of a decade. Then she showed them what came next. The same species 40 years after that destruction had rebuilt everything. And not just rebuilt, expanded, innovated. AG launched the beginning of their space program, had in a period of decades gone from fighting in trenches to walking on their moon. They rebuild, she said, every time. The speed of reconstruction after major conflict is consistently faster than what demographic and resource models would predict. It is as if the act of destruction creates in them something like urgency. She stopped on a human word she had found in the cultural records. Once she had looked it up 3 times to make sure she understood it correctly. The humans have a term, she said. They call it being forged, as in the way metal is made stronger by heat and pressure. They apply this concept not just to individuals, but to their civilization as a whole. They believe, and their history appears to support, that difficulty makes them stronger rather than weaker. The room was completely silent. In the observation gallery above the chamber floor, Ambassador Voss sat in a chair she had borrowed from a confused staff member who hadn't been sure he was allowed to refuse her. She had been there for the last 2 hours. She had watched the room fill up. She had watched the delegates stop checking their other work. She had watched Arshan Velserath arrive 40 minutes ago, find a seat near the back, and not leave. He had not looked at his communication device once since sitting down. Not for a being who ran 27 committee meetings a week, that was notable. Voss watched his face. She knew the look. She had seen it on human faces too, in moments when people encountered something they did not know how to categorize. A kind of careful stillness, the expression of a mind working very hard to process something it had not prepared for. Nimara reached the final section of her preliminary findings. She set down her notes and spoke without them. "But I want to be careful," she said to the room, "about how I characterize what I found in this file. It would be easy to present it as a history of a violent species that has not yet grown out of its destructive behavior. I thought that was what I would find at the start. But the more I read, the more I felt that was not quite right." She paused. "There is something in the human war record that I did not expect. Something underneath all the strategy and the casualties and the weapons. I found it in the small documents. The personal letters soldiers wrote home, the journals, the poems that survived from ancient wars." She looked out at the silent room. They knew it was terrible. They always knew. They fought anyway. And they never, in 10,000 years of record, completely stopped believing that it would eventually end. Delegate Oren asked the first question in a room that had forgotten how to make small talk. "How many of their historical wars resulted in a lasting peace?" he asked. Nimara looked at her data. "Every single one," she said. "Eventually." Nobody laughed. Nearby, Velsarath sat with his old hands resting flat on his knees and said nothing for a very long time. And in the quiet that settled over the chamber, like something heavy and honest, the Galactic Council began, for the first time, to understand what it had let through its door. But the academic chamber had not been this full in over a decade. Word had moved fast through the station in the way that genuinely unusual things always do. Not through official channels or formal announcements, but through the quieter routes. A staff member mentioning it to a colleague in a corridor, a delegate sending a short message to a counterpart across the hall, a researcher stopping another researcher by the arm and saying simply, "Wash, you need to go see this." By the time Nimara began the second session, there were over 200 people in the room and more standing along the edges. The tiered seating was full. Senior delegates who had spent years sending junior staff to these presentations were seated in the front rows. Archon Velsarath had returned. He had brought two of his senior advisors. Ambassador Voss was in the same chair in the observation gallery. She had not moved it. Nimara stood at the front of the room and looked at the faces before her. She had not expected this. She had prepared her data, organized her presentation, chosen her evidence carefully. She had not prepared for the weight of the room's attention. She took a breath and reminded herself that she was a scholar presenting research. That was all she was doing. She started. "In the previous session," she said, "I presented the large-scale record of human warfare, the statistics, the timelines, in the strategic and philosophical frameworks they built around conflict. Today I want to go smaller." She opened a new file on her display. Among the material in the Human Archive is a category of document that has no direct equivalent in most other species' historical records. The humans call them personal accounts. Letters written between soldiers and their families. Private journals kept during active combat. Recordings made by ordinary individuals in the middle of extraordinary events. She looked down at her notes for a moment. These were not written for history. They were written because the people writing them needed to write them. That distinction matters. She moved to the specific file she had chosen. It had taken her a long time to choose it. There were thousands to pick from, stretching across centuries. She had read dozens. Late in the nights when the academic chamber was empty and her reading light was the only one on. She had chosen this one because it was ordinary, because the man who wrote it was not famous, because he had not done anything the history books recorded as remarkable. That, she had decided, was exactly the point. "I want to present the personal diary of a human named Arik Holt," she said. "He was born in the year 2089 on a human colony world. Before the war, he was a primary school teacher. He taught children between the ages of 6 and 11. His recorded evaluations from that period describe him as patient, methodical, and particularly good at helping children who struggled with reading." She let the room hold that image for a moment. "He was conscripted in 2114 at the beginning of what humans call the Terran Unification Wars, the last major armed conflict in their history before first contact with alien species. It was, by any standard, a brutal war. It lasted 11 years. It involved fighting on 4 planets and 2 orbital stations. Casualty figures are estimated at over 40 million. Holt served for 6 years on the front line before the conflict in his sector ended." She began reading from the diary. The council's translator system was one of the most sophisticated pieces of technology on the station. It had been designed to carry not just meaning, but tone. She had asked it, for this session, honored to preserve the human rhythm of the language as closely as possible. The first entry she read was from Holt's second month of service. He described a place called an outpost. Cold, he wrote, the kind of cold that comes through your boots. He described the soldiers he had been assigned to, men and women he had not known 2 months earlier, and now ate every meal with and slept alongside. He used their first names. Thought he described one of them laughing so hard at a bad joke that he fell off a crate and bruised his shoulder, and then laughed harder at himself. He described being homesick and not knowing quite what for, because the colony where he was born wasn't home anymore, and the home he missed was something that didn't exist in any physical place. He thought it might be his daughter's voice. She was 2 years old. She had just started stringing words together into small sentences when he left. The room was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when 200 people are breathing carefully. Nimara moved forward in the diary. She selected entries across the 6 years deliberately, letting the room follow the arc of a man moving through a war the way a person moves through weather, sometimes sheltered, sometimes exposed, always changed by it. There was an entry from the 3rd year where Holt wrote about killing someone for the first time at close range. He did not write about it the way war stories were written. He did not call the other man an enemy or a target or a threat. He wrote that the man had been wearing worn boots and had a scar on his chin, and had looked, in the last second, like someone who was also tired. Holt wrote that he thought about that man for a long time afterward, and that thinking about it did not make it easier, but he had decided that it shouldn't be easy. He wrote, I think if it ever stops being hard, I should be worried about myself. Delegate Arun, seated in the front row, was completely still. A Kelvery academic 2 rows behind him had stopped writing in her notes. Her stylus was resting on the page. She hadn't moved it in several minutes. Nimara continued. There was an entry from the 4th year about a battle that Holt's unit had lost badly. Not just lost, had been pushed back so far that the outpost they had held for 8 months was now in enemy hands. He listed the names of the people in his unit who had died in those 8 months. There were 11 names. He had a sentence after each name. Not a eulogy, not a formal tribute. Just one thing about each person. One small, specific detail that he remembered. One man had been learning to draw. One woman had collected small rocks from every place she was stationed. One young soldier had always, without fail, shared food when anyone else ran short, even when he had barely enough himself. He closed that entry with a single line. The ground we lost can be taken back. These cannot. I don't know what to do with that. I am going to sleep and try again tomorrow. In the observation gallery, Ambassador Voss was very still. She had read the file herself months ago in her preparation for this assignment. She had read this diary. She had thought she was past the part of reading it where it moved her. She had been wrong. Nimara read through the 5th year. A period of long stillness in the war. No major battles, just cold and waiting, and the particular misery of a conflict that wasn't ending, but wasn't moving either. Holt wrote during this period about a human concept he called the mathematics of survival. He had started counting, in the back of his mind, the probabilities. How long could a person continue to not be the one who didn't come back? He wrote that he didn't think the calculation was useful, but his mind kept doing it anyway. He late at night, like a problem that wouldn't let him rest. He wrote that the only thing that seemed to interrupt the calculation was deciding, every morning when he woke up, that today was not the day to worry about tomorrow. He called this, with the dry humor that ran like a thread through all his writing, an extremely stupid coping mechanism that appeared to be working. Several beings in the room made a sound that was the alien equivalent of a quiet, helpless laugh. Then they stopped, here because laughing felt wrong, and also because they weren't sure it was funny, and also because they weren't sure it wasn't. Nimara came to the final entry. This was written the morning before Holt's final major engagement, she said. His unit was ordered to take and hold a communications facility on a contested orbital station. The fighting was expected to be significant. He knew that. Everyone in the unit knew that. She read the entry. In it, Holt talked about his daughter. E, who was now 8 years old and apparently building something large out of scrap components in their backyard, according to letters from his sister. He said he didn't know if he was going to be good at being a father after this, because he wasn't sure yet who he was after this, but he thought he would try very hard and that trying very hard had to count for something. He talked about the soldiers in his unit, different names now than the original list, most of them, but the same mornings. Who were the same bad jokes, the same ritual of checking each other's equipment before a mission. He said that somewhere along the way, he had stopped understanding why the war started and started understanding why it had to end, and that the two things were completely different. He closed the entry with this: "I don't think we were made for this, but I think we became good at it so that the ones who weren't made for it would never have to be." Nimara stopped reading. The room was silent for a long time. Not the silence of people waiting for the next thing, the silence of people who needed a moment, the silence of beings from 40 different worlds sitting with something that had come through the translator system and landed without permission somewhere quiet and unguarded in their chests. Velsarath had not moved in over an hour. He sat with his old golden eyes fixed on the middle distance, his long hands resting flat on his knees, and said nothing. After a time he spoke. His voice came out measured and careful, the way it always did. But there was something different underneath it, something that had not been there before. "How many of these ordinary men does humanity have?" he asked. The question was directed at Nimara, but it was Ambassador Voss from the gallery above who answered. Her voice was quiet, but the translator carried it clearly to every ear in the room. "All of them, Archon," she said. Every single one." The silence that followed was the longest one yet, and in it, something shifted in the Galactic Council, something that could not be calculated or measured, something that had nothing to do with political process or civilizational metrics or the formal language of assessments and votes. Something that felt, to everyone in that room, very much like the moment just before everything changes. The closed session was called within 2 hours of the end of Nimara's presentation. And these sessions were rare. They were reserved for situations that the Council considered sensitive enough to remove from the official record until a resolution had been reached. In 9,000 years of operation, the Eternal Conclave Station had hosted fewer than 40 of them. They were called for things like the discovery of a new extinction-level threat, the collapse of a major member civilization, or the emergence of information that, if made public too quickly, might cause widespread panic. The fact that one was being called now, triggered by a civilizational assessment of a species that had joined the Council less than 2 months ago, was not lost on anyone in the room. Ambassador Voss was not invited. She found this out when she returned to her quarters and discovered a brief notification on her terminal informing her that the academic chamber session had been reclassified, that the observation gallery had been closed, and that the Council would contact her when they were ready to proceed. She read the message twice. Then she sat down at her desk and looked at the viewport for a while. She had been in enough closed rooms to know roughly what was happening in this one. She had known before she ever arrived at the station that this moment was a possibility. She had prepared for it. She was prepared for it now. She made herself tea and waited. In the closed session, Velsarath opened proceedings without his usual measured calm. He moved directly to the concern that everyone in the room was already holding. "The question before this body," he said, "is not whether humanity's history is impressive. The question is whether humanity's history is safe." He had put into words what several delegates had been working towards saying for the past hour. The room responded with the particular energy of people who had been waiting for permission to be worried. The Theran delegate spoke first. Their species was large, physically imposing, and had spent centuries building a reputation for military readiness. They were not easily alarmed. They were alarmed now. "The record is clear," she said. "This species fought continuous wars for 10,000 years. They developed civilization-ending weapons on 3 separate occasions. They possess a biological tendency toward organized violence that is, by any standard metric, far beyond the range of normal for spacefaring species. We invited them onto this station." She paused. "Our station? That is not a small consideration." Several voices agreed, not all of them. Delegate Orun of the Fari listened carefully and said nothing for a while. He had spent the time since Nimara's session reading portions of the human file himself, pulling up sections that Nimera had referenced, following threads. He had read Holt's diary in full, and he had also read something else, a section of the file that Nimera had not yet presented in her assessment. He had found it himself late in the night, following a reference note in the index. He waited for the right moment, then spoke. "I want to ask," he said, "whether anyone in this room has looked at the full file, not the war history, the rest of it." The room was quiet. "Because the war history is in the first half," he said. "There is a second half." He looked at Velsarath. "P-Wood, I would suggest we ask Ambassador Voss to address the chamber before we take any vote." There was resistance to this. There were arguments about protocol and procedure and the value of keeping the deliberation internal. There were delegates who felt that inviting a representative of the species under discussion into a closed session set a problematic precedent. In the end, the vote to invite Voss was narrow, but it passed. She arrived within 15 minutes, on which told the room she had been close. She walked in without hurry, found a position at the speaking floor, and looked at the assembled delegates without obvious emotion. "Ambassador," Velsarath said, "the Council has concerns about humanity's civilizational profile, specifically regarding the nature and extent of your species' history of armed conflict. You have been asked to address those concerns?" Voss nodded. "I understand," she said. "You are aware of what is in the file?" "I am." "Then you understand," Velsarath said, "why some members of this council are suggesting that humanity's admission may have been premature." Voss was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was even. "I understand that some members are looking at the first half of the file," she said. "I'd like to talk about the second half." She had not brought a display setup. She had not known in advance that she would be speaking today. She spoke from memory, which several delegates would note later, was itself a strange kind of demonstration. "Every war in human history ended," she began. "Delegate Orun already asked Nimera this question, and that was the answer. Every single one, including the ones that looked at the time like they never would." She paused. "But what I want to talk about is what happened after." She walked the room through it without notes, without a display, Tawaki with only her voice and the translator carrying her words to 200 ears. After the largest wars came the hospitals. Humans had a medical tradition that stretched back nearly as far as their military one, and the two had always moved in parallel. Every major conflict in human history had produced advances in emergency medicine, trauma care, rehabilitation. Humans had learned to save lives in the wreckage of the places where they had lost them. After the largest wars came the trials. She described the human concept of war crimes tribunals, formal legal proceedings, established by the humans themselves, to hold their own leaders and soldiers accountable for specific acts committed during conflict. This was not something another species had imposed on them. They had created it themselves. They had established the principle that there were things you were not permitted to do, even in war, and that violating those things had consequences, regardless of which side you were on. Well, they held themselves responsible, she said. Not perfectly, not always, but consistently enough that the standard existed and grew stronger across generations. She talked about the monuments. Every human culture had them. Physical structures built to remember the dead, not to glorify the wars, but to refuse to let the cost of them be forgotten. She talked about the literature, the novels, the poems, the plays that human writers had produced in the aftermath of conflicts, works that did not celebrate war but examined it honestly, that asked the questions the official records didn't ask, that made space for the grief and the damage and the complexity of what had happened. Many of those works were still being read centuries after the wars that had produced them. She talked about reconciliation, the human word that had no clean equivalent in most galactic languages, the formal and informal processes by which former enemies had, repeatedly throughout human history, found ways to exist in peace, not easy peace, not peace that pretended nothing had happened, peace built deliberately on top of acknowledged pain by people who had decided to choose the future over the past. It never happened automatically, she said. It always required work. It usually took generations. It always left scars. But it happened, reliably, in culture after culture, century after century. They found the way to the other side of it. The room was attentive in a different way than it had been during Nimara's presentation. That attention had been the attention of people encountering something they had not expected. This attention was the attention of people being asked to reconsider something they had already formed an opinion about. She saved the last point for the end. Every species in this room, she said, evolved in an environment where survival required specific adaptations. Your species adapted to specific pressures. So did ours. The pressure that shaped humanity from the beginning was conflict. We adapted to it. We got very good at it. That is in the file, and you have all seen it. She looked around the room. But adaptation to conflict is not the same as being defined by it. What you haven't seen, what doesn't make it into the war records, is the thing that never stopped running alongside all of it. She paused. Humans never stopped believing it would get better. Through every century of that file, through every war and every loss and every generation that was handed a world still carrying damage from the last time. They kept building, they kept teaching their children, they kept writing, they kept trying to make things that would last. That is not the behavior of a species that wants to destroy. That is the behavior of a species that has never been allowed to stop fighting long enough to do anything else. And that, every time it gets the chance, chooses to build. She stopped speaking. The room held the silence that followed. After a long moment, she looked directly at Velserath. You asked whether humanity is safe, she said. I won't tell you we are. I'm not sure safety is a meaningful concept for any species with our history. What I can tell you is this. Every dangerous thing humanity ever developed, it developed because it was trying to survive. And every time it survived, it tried to do better. She held his gaze. That is not a threat to your civilization. That is the most useful thing you have ever let through that door. The silence lasted a long time. Then Delegate Oren started to clap. It was slow and deliberate. The unhurried sound of someone making a considered decision rather than an emotional one. It spread, not immediately, not to everyone, but it spread, moving around the room in the careful way that honest things move. Not because someone told it to, but because it had somewhere true to go. Velserath did not clap, but he did not raise his hand for the containment vote either. He sat in his chair with his old eyes steady and his expression unreadable. And he thought about 10,000 years of a species choosing every morning to try again tomorrow. And he said nothing, which for Velserath was a very loud kind of answer. The formal session was scheduled for the third day after the closed deliberation. It was, by tradition, a ceremony. The largest room on the Eternal Conclave Station was called the Grand Floor, and it was exactly what the name suggested. A vast circular space with tiered seating for 2,000 delegates, out a domed ceiling that displayed the surrounding star systems in slow real-time movement, and acoustics designed so that a voice speaking at normal volume at the center could be heard clearly at every seat. It had been built to hold important moments. It knew how to hold them. The full council assembled at the appointed hour. All 47 member species were present, represented by their full delegations. Banners hung from the walls, each species' colors, each with the mark of the council at the center. The domed ceiling showed the slow wheel of stars above them, turning the way it always had, indifferent to whatever small and significant things happened beneath it. These sessions were normally loud before they began. Delegates talked, exchanged greetings, reviewed the day's agenda on their terminals. There was music, a rotating selection from member civilizations, played softly through the hall's sound system as people found their seats. The atmosphere was usually something between a formal political gathering and a social event for people who had known each other for years. Today, the room was quiet before it was supposed to be. People had come in, found their seats, and stilled. There was no particular instruction to do so. No announcement had been made. It happened the way things happen when a large group of people share a feeling and don't need to discuss it. They had all been in the chamber for Nimara's presentations, or they had heard about them in full from someone who had been. They had sat with the content for 3 days. The quiet was something that had been building, and now it had found its place. Archon Velserath entered last, as was his custom. He walked to the central speaking platform with the same measured pace he always used, descended the few steps to the floor level, and stood at the center of the room. that he was old enough that the 2,000 delegates around him included many who had been born after he took his seat. He had seen the council through wars between member species, through the near collapse of two civilizations, through the long negotiations that had several times pulled the galaxy back from outcomes no one wanted. He was, in the estimation of most beings who had met him, close to indestructible. He stood at the center of the room and did not immediately speak. What he did, it instead was something no sitting Archon had done in recorded council history. He called for silence. Not the silence that falls when a session formally opens. Not the ritualized quiet that precedes a vote. A deliberate, specific, named silence. He raised one hand slowly and spoke 4 words before it. A moment, he said, for recognition. 2,000 delegates stilled. The music that had been playing through the hall cut off. The ambient sound of a room full of breathing beings settled into something close to nothing. Vel-Sarath lowered his hand and stood without speaking, and the room stood with him, and the silence spread outward and upward into the dome where the stars turned slowly and did not care about anything below. It lasted 60 seconds, precisely 60. Later, people would argue about whether he had counted it or simply felt it, and no one would ever know the answer. When it ended, Vel-Sarath spoke. This council has, in 9,000 years of operation, admitted 47 civilizations to full membership. Most of those admissions were straightforward. We reviewed, we voted, we welcomed. In some cases, we found species that surprised us, that offered something we had not expected. He paused. In rare cases, we found something that required us to reconsider what we thought we understood. He looked at the human delegation. Ambassador Voss was seated in the section reserved for new member species, with 3 aides beside her. She had dressed carefully that morning. She was sitting very still, her hands folded in her lap, her expression composed. Humanity's civilizational readiness assessment, Vel-Sarath said, produced documentation that this council required 3 days of closed deliberation to fully process. That is not common. That is, in fact, unprecedented. He let the words sit there for a moment. And the debate within those sessions was substantive, and I will not pretend it was without tension. There were members of this council who argued that humanity's history presented an unacceptable risk. Those arguments were made with reason and with genuine concern, and they were heard. He paused again. They were also, in my estimation, incomplete. In the front row of the observer gallery, Nimara sat with her data tablet closed on her knee. She had not opened it all morning, but she did not need it for this. What the risk assessment failed to account for, Vel-Sarath continued, was not in the war record. It was in what surrounded the war record. The rebuilding, the accountability, the persistence. He looked out across the 2,000 faces before him. There is a human concept that none of our translators have a clean, single-word equivalent for. In their language, it sounds like this. He pronounced it carefully in the original human phoneme. Hope. When they define it as the belief that a better outcome is possible, even when the evidence suggests otherwise. He let the room hold that for a moment. In 10,000 years of recorded conflict, humanity never abandoned that belief. Not collectively, not permanently. Every generation that inherited a damaged world tried to repair it. Every people that was told the situation was beyond recovery found a way to recover anyway. He looked at the human delegation. That is not the profile of a species that destroys. That is the profile of a species that does not know how to give up. The vote was taken. It ran in full across the council's formal system, open to every member in real time. The results displayed above the chamber floor in the shifting light as each delegation's decision registered. Full, unrestricted council membership for humanity. No conditions, no review period, no limitations on representation or vote weight. The final count was 39 in favor, 6 abstentions, 2 against. The 2 votes against came from delegations that had been concerned from the beginning and had not changed their position. They were noted in the record and respected. The abstentions were recorded without comment. The 39 yes votes lit up the board in the gold that the council used for positive results, and the gold spread across the display like sunrise. The room did not erupt. There was no immediate roar of sound. The response was slower than that, and for that reason it was heavier. It started with a sound from the ferry delegation. Delegate Oren, standing, bringing his hands together in the human gesture he had clearly looked up and decided to use deliberately. It spread to neighboring delegations, then across the room in a slow, genuine wave, the sound of 2,000 beings acknowledging something real. Voss stood up when it reached her. She stood very straight and very still and let it reach her. And if there was something in her eyes that was not purely professional composure, she allowed it. She did not fight it. She had held herself composed through days of presentations and deliberations and quiet waiting. And this was the moment she had held herself together for, and she let herself feel it. In the gallery, Nimara was quietly taking notes. She had reopened her tablet. She was writing down the exact time, or the exact wording of Velsarath's statement, the numbers of the vote. She was a scholar. She documented things. That was what she did. She was also, if anyone had been close enough to see it, blinking more than usual. The weeks that followed were not quiet. Within 10 days of the formal vote, 3 separate council member species submitted official requests through diplomatic channels for what they carefully described as advisory consultation on strategic conflict assessment. 2 of them were military powers with long histories of their own. One of them had not fought a war in 2,000 years, but apparently found the idea of human strategic insight worth having. The requests were all directed to the human delegation. Voss handled them with calm efficiency. She forwarded them to the appropriate offices on Earth. She said nothing public about them. She wrote in her private log that she had expected curiosity to follow the vote, but had not expected it to move this fast. The Kelvari University of Applied History formally established a Department of Terran Conflict Studies within 3 weeks. It was the first academic program in the Council's known history dedicated to the study of a single non-member species military record. The fact that humanity was now a member species meant this was technically a study of a current partner civilization's past, which had never been done formally before. The department received more application requests in its first week than its founding faculty had expected in its first year. Nimara was offered the position of founding department head. She asked for 2 weeks to consider it. She spent those 2 weeks finishing her assessment document, the one she had been working on since the first 11-hour archive download. It came to 912 pages. She had a title for it already, had known the title for a while, had written it down in her notes late on the 4th night of reading, when she had finally found the words for what she was looking at. She called it, "On the Species That Waged 10,000 Years of War, and Still Had the Audacity to Hope." She accepted the department head position. She submitted the document to the Kelvari Academic Press on the same day. It was published 6 weeks later. Within a year, it was the most requested document in the Council's Central Academic Archive. Translations into 31 galactic languages were commissioned within 2 years. The words for which no direct translation existed were kept in the original human phoneme, including the last one she had written about, the one that sounded like hope. On Earth, the news of full council membership arrived on a Thursday morning, broadcasts across every communication network on the planet and its colonies. People stopped what they were doing to watch the announcement. In cities and farming settlements, in orbital habitats and desert outposts, humans looked at screens and listened. Then, for the most part, they went back to what they were doing. There were celebrations. They were genuine and warm and scattered across thousands of locations on a dozen worlds. There were speeches and broadcasts and school assemblies and public events. There was a moment, replayed across the networks for weeks afterward, of a group of children somewhere in the northern part of the oldest continent on Earth, watching the announcement in a classroom and then bursting into loud, slightly chaotic applause that their teacher made no effort to stop. But the planet did not stop moving. Yes, there was still work to be done. There always was. Problems that had existed before the announcement continued to exist. Infrastructure that needed building. Arguments that needed resolving. Research that needed completing. Children that needed teaching. The world turned the way it always had, because humanity had never actually stopped to wait for the galaxy to notice it. Nimara wrote a short final note in her personal record, separate from the published assessment. And she never published this one. It was for herself. She wrote, "I spent 4 months reading about a species that has been fighting since before they had writing to record it. I expected to find monsters. I found something that frightened me more than monsters would have. I found people who knew exactly what they were capable of and kept showing up anyway, who built things they knew might be destroyed, who loved people they knew they might lose, who continued every single morning of 10,000 years to believe the next thing they built would last longer than the last one. Asterisk. She paused in her writing. Outside the window of her office, the star field was quiet and enormous. I don't think we understood what we were inviting in, she wrote. I'm not sure we understand it fully yet, but I think it is the best decision this council has ever made. She closed her tablet. On the station, in the long, quiet corridor outside the grand floor, Vel Sarath walked alone after the session had ended, as he sometimes did when he needed to think. He was old. He had seen many things. He had watched species rise and diminish and end. He had voted for 47 admissions and argued against more than he had voted for because he was careful, because carefulness was the thing that 9,000 years of doing a difficult job had taught him. He thought about the diary, about the teacher who had become a soldier who had become a teacher again. Thought about the last entry, written the morning before a battle, about being made for things and choosing them anyway. He stopped at the viewport at the corridor's end. The stars were there, where they always were. He stood there for a long time, thinking about hope and what it cost and why it persisted. He did not have an answer. That, he thought, was perhaps the most human thing of all.